Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for attending the fourth and final webinar in our series on the future of Alberta policing. My name is Mitch Peacock. I'm your moderator today. For those of you I haven't had a chance to cross paths with so far, I've spent more than 25 years as an announcer in television, radio, and streaming, with roles ranging from hosting the evening news on CBC in Winnipeg to host of Calgary Flames Radio. Appreciate the opportunity to work with you here today. It's great to be along. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a couple of housekeeping items. As you hear from our panelists, we invite you to submit your questions anytime using the Q&A box on the right side of your screens. It's as simple as typing in the question and then hitting the send button. Following the presentations, I will relay your questions to our panelists, and we're going to do our best to compile and answer as many of those questions as we can within the 30-minute time frame allotted. Our session this morning explores an opportunity for evolution in Alberta's policing, and our speakers will discuss the importance of modern professional police services that emphasize partnerships to address social challenges. It expands police training to emphasize a police service's shared role in resolving social challenges, prioritizes diversity in recruitment to ensure a police service resembles the community it serves, and implements needed reforms. Fortunate to have two esteemed panelists with us today. They include Dr. Kanika Samuels-Wortley. Dr. Samuels-Wortley is an assistant professor at Toronto Metropolitan University's Department of Criminology. Her areas of interest include race and racism, youth delinquency, policing, corrections, and critical race theory. Currently, she is collaborating on numerous projects exploring race and racialization among incarcerated individuals, the policing of hate crime, and the surveillance of racialized communities. We welcome Dr. Samuels-Wortley, and thank you for being with us today. Our second speaker is Dr. Christian Leuprecht. Dr. Leuprecht is the class of 1965 professor in leadership in the Department of Political Science and Economics at the Royal Military College of Canada. He is the director of the Institute of Intergovernmental Relations at Queen's University School of Policy Studies. Dr. Leuprecht is also the provincial appointee for the Kingston Police Services Board. However, the views shared today are his own and do not represent that of the board or the police service. Welcome to Dr. Leuprecht as well. I'll now turn the floor over to our first panelist of the day, Dr. Samuels-Wortley, for her presentation.
Thank you so much, Mitch. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the organizers for this invitation to speak on this important issue. Also, before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you all from Toronto Metropolitan University, which is located in the Dish with One Spoon territory and the traditional home to the Mississaugas, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples. As a Black Canadian, I recognize that I am a beneficiary of colonialism, but as a descendant of enslaved African peoples, I stand in solidarity with Indigenous communities. I acknowledge that as a non-Indigenous person, I am in a privileged position as a researcher when speaking on Indigenous issues, which I will be doing today. Therefore, I'm always open to hearing feedback from Indigenous peoples on how my research may impact their communities. If I could have the next slide, please. Discussing race and racism is often a very controversial and emotional issue among Canadians. We typically view ourselves as a nation that embraces diversity and are more racially tolerant than our neighbor to the south. We have faith that our national commitment to equality, which is supported by legal statutes such as the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, protects all citizens from unfair or discriminatory treatment. Internationally, Canada is often perceived to be a multicultural utopia, a nation that has largely escaped the ills of racism that has contributed to excessive police use of force in racialized communities, as well as the over-policing and subsequent over-representation of racialized peoples in the American correctional system. If I could have the next slide, please. This is consistent with the New York Times piece by John F. Burns, in which he writes, Toronto's claim to have one of the best records on race relations of any major North American city has been shaken in the last week by scenes of anger between the city's Black population and its overwhelmingly white police force, after a white constable was charged with manslaughter in the shooting death of a 44-year-old Black man. For many years, Canadian cities have celebrated their success in avoiding many of the problems that have tormented large cities in the United States. But lately, there has been growing concern that Canada may, after all, be facing many of the same difficulties, including racial tensions. After the fatal shootings of 2 Black men by the police in Toronto 10 years ago, measures to improve race relations were announced, among them enlisting more racialized people in the force. But the latest incidents have raised doubts that much, if anything, was accomplished. This article, speaking to racial tensions between the police and Black communities, appeared in the New York Times on January 18, 1989. But eerily, every sentiment that is expressed in this article would resonate today. More than 20 years ago, the police-initiated shooting death of Lester Donaldson drew outrage from the Black community. This incident took place 12 years after a groundbreaking task force report identifying racial bias and discrimination within policing as a systemic issue, largely impacting members of the Black and other racialized communities. This report, written in 1977, was titled "Now It's Not Too Late," and it called for drastic changes to policing. If I could have the next slide, please. Yet in 2022, it appears that we continue to see similar headlines and are having the same conversations. So while we are here to discuss the future of policing, it is important to note that very little has changed from our past. Canadians simply do not know the impact of race and racial discrimination with respect to the operation of the Canadian criminal justice system. Historical formal and informal bans on the collection and dissemination of racial data within policing, the courts, and corrections has greatly impeded research on both race and crime and racial bias. Thus, in Canada, we continue to look at justice through a colorblind lens. There is an illusion of race neutrality, even as racial disparities in our criminal justice system widen. If I could have the next slide, please. Therefore, when thinking about the future of law enforcement, it is imperative to explore how race and racism influence the operation of policing. Having a better understanding of the impact of racial bias and discrimination will help promote meaningful reform strategies to improve how the police interact with members from racialized communities. If I could have the next slide, please. The research I'll be talking about today examines youth perceptions of the police among Black and Indigenous youth in Canada. This is part of a larger study that examines a racially diverse sample of youth in Canada. However, the focus on Black and Indigenous stories for today's presentation aims to provide a better understanding of the impact that race and racism plays in the lives of racialized people. And this is to demonstrate the nuances between their lived experience and attitudes towards law enforcement. I will begin by briefly reviewing the literature on perceptions of the police. I will then discuss the research question and findings from my study. Finally, I will discuss policy implications. The next slide, please. So why focus on policing? Statistics indicate that Indigenous peoples now account for 30% of Canada's correctional population, despite representing only 5% of the overall population. Similarly, Black peoples are the fastest growing racial group within our prison system. But policing is a particularly important criminal justice institution to explore. As the initial point of contact with the community and the almost unlimited discretionary powers to interpret and enforce the law, police are the gatekeepers to the justice system. Therefore, critically examining the role of policing in modern society and knowing how citizens perceive and interact with law enforcement officials has captured both academic and mainstream interest. If I could have the next slide, please. So I study perceptions of the police. Perceptions of the police are consistently identified as an important academic area of study. Research suggests that citizens who have negative perceptions of the police are less likely to report criminal activity and cooperate with police investigations. Furthermore, negative perceptions of the police may lead to distrust in the overall criminal justice system as well as other social institutions. And finally, there is a growing body of research which suggests that negative perceptions of the police may reduce citizen compliance with the law. And a growing number of scholars maintain this may be particularly relevant within racialized communities. These scholars argue that direct and vicarious experiences with racial discrimination can erode confidence in the criminal justice system and contribute to perceptions of social injustice. Perceptions of injustice, in turn, may directly influence decisions to engage in criminal behavior. Therefore, it's been argued that community perceptions of the police can directly impact public safety. As such, it's important to understand how citizens perceive the police. We have the next slide, please. So for my study, I asked the following question. Do lived experiences with the police impact youth perceptions of law enforcement? May I have the next slide, please? I aim to highlight the stories of Black and Indigenous youth as a means to counter the equality narrative that is promoted by most, if not all, Canadian police organizations. The police maintain that they engage with all members of the community in a fair and respectful manner. To illustrate, as presented on their website, the Toronto Police Service highlights that they respect and uphold the rights and freedoms of all citizens. They state that their officers are free from bias or stereotypes and are held to a higher standard by being accountable for inappropriate behavior. Furthermore, they state that they treat all people with empathy, respect, equity, and dignity, and will, and I quote, go the extra mile to ensure that others feel safe. May I have the next slide, please? However, I highlight the following story told by a young Black girl to counter this police narrative. When asked to describe her most memorable encounter with the police, she states, my friends and I were having a small campfire at a school field after hours. Somebody called to report a fire or the smoke. So the police ended up showing up. We all got kind of scared, so my friend started running. The first thing the cop did was pull his gun and point it towards us. I was explaining that we were having a small fire and roasting marshmallows. He was asking me questions like who I was and what I was doing with the gun pointed at me the whole time. After I explained everything to him, he kind of just made me put out the fire, and he didn't put his gun away until I put out the fire. Then nothing went further. I was 13. So having a gun drawn to put out a fire is how a Black girl experienced an encounter with a police officer in Toronto. Stories like this, I am sure, would horrify the public, including members of the police community. However, traditionally, we've privileged and accepted the narrative of police officials who deny the extent of racism within law enforcement over members of racialized communities who've in fact experienced it. May I have the next slide, please? So for my study, I conducted semi-structured interviews with 34 Indigenous, Black, and white youth. I asked questions about their overall impressions of the police, whether they trust and respect the police, and their perceptions of safety in the presence of police. Youth were also asked to share any positive and negative interactions that they had experienced with the police. I also specifically asked about the factors that help shape their opinions of law enforcement and the broader justice system. The aim of gathering a racially diverse sample of youth stories was to explore, who in fact experienced the police narrative that maintains that police officers engage with all members of the community in a fair and respectful manner. Of course, scholars and police advocates will argue that the police will only target individuals who commit crime and that higher rates of offending among Black and Indigenous people is what accounts for their overrepresentation in our criminal justice system. However, research reveals racially biased policing behaviors and practices also contribute to racial disparities in our justice system. For decades, Black and Indigenous communities in Canada have raised concerns that they are subject to higher levels of police surveillance or are subject to racial profiling, which reflects the belief that officers often focus on the race of civilians rather than individualized suspicion or behavior. But what does racial profiling look like, and what does it feel like? I turn to the story of a young Black man to provide some insight. The next slide, please. So this young Black man states, there's a group of us that got stopped. I was the only Black guy in the group, so they weren't talking to anyone else and only made eye contact with me. And they were asking about a crime. Something had happened, someone got robbed. They wanted to take me in for questioning for absolutely no reason. For me, I feel like if that's the case, why stop me? Why ask me? And why not everyone else around me? This youth goes on to state this about the police. You can't trust them after that. When you're a youth and you see that, you kind of make mental notes about it. You don't want to trust them, you don't want to be around them, and you don't want to respect them. So a great deal is described in this narrative. Feelings of being treated differently from a group of friends from another racial background, feeling singled out because of one's race and subsequent feelings feelings of lack of trust and respect. It's also important to note that this youth's overall perception of the police has been strongly influenced by this one negative encounter. Thus, encounters with the police that are perceived to be influenced by racial bias are not easily forgotten or dismissed. The next slide, please. Further analysis uncovered three major themes. Compared to their white counterparts, Black and Indigenous youth, 1, express that they do not feel that they are treated equally or respectfully. 2, they believe that the police contribute to the criminalization of racialized youth. And finally, 3, they believe that the police do not serve their interests or protect racialized communities. In essence, their narratives demonstrate that these youth feel excluded from the protection of a legal institution that is meant to serve and protect them. The next slide, please. To explore feelings of unequal treatment a bit further, I turn to the words of a Black youth who states the following. I respect the time officers put in their jobs, but in my community, I see it all the time. Your officers racially profile. They are unfair. You believe we're all doing crime, but that's unfair because for the good guys that don't do anything, they still target us without actual proof, which I feel is disrespectful and not professional. Another Black youth retells this story. I came out of my building and I was walking. I saw a cop was staring at me and I was like, whatever. The cop pulled up beside me and asked what I was doing. He said he wanted to do a search and I said I didn't consent. I was 14. He asked things like, what is your name? And trying to get information. I stated that this was racial profiling and he just left. I knew my rights. I think he said something about something happened in the area and I fit the description. I was mad about it, but you have to pick yourself up and dust yourself off and go on about your day. Out of 10 Black kids, 8 will experience a racial situation with the police. I feel like it's just something you have to come to terms with. That statement is quite powerful. Is this what it means to be a young Black boy in Canada? That racial bias within policing is so normalized that experiences with racial profiling and unequal treatment is something that Black youth expect and have to come to terms with. These selective narratives put troubling statistics into the context of lived experience. To illustrate, studies conducted in Toronto, Halifax, Montreal, and Vancouver reveal that Black and Indigenous peoples, more specifically Black and Indigenous men, are grossly overrepresented in official street check data. Furthermore, a number of surveys have shown that Black people are more likely to report multiple police stop and search incidents than respondents from other racial groups. Importantly, racial differences with respect to police contact remain, even after controlling for relevant factors, including gender, social class, neighborhood characteristics, and criminal behavior. In other words, racial differences in police contact cannot be explained away by poverty or involvement in crime. Race matters. If you're a Black man in Canada, the question is not if you'll be stopped by police, but a matter of when. The next slide, please. The narratives of some Black and Indigenous youth suggest that they believe police aim to criminalize them, more than to offer safety and protection. To illustrate, one young Black woman states the following. I think there are certain communities the police protect and certain communities they enforce. The communities they protect are upper middle class neighborhoods that are mostly white. And then in areas where they have darker skin, they're just stopping people on the street and collecting information on them so that they're an easier target to enforce in the future. A young Indigenous man expressed this. The police will use anything to get me. You all come in Native communities and look down on us when you talk to us. You're always looking around, searching for something, even when there's no reason to look around. This young man makes a powerful observation. The police do have a significant role in defining and constructing who is a criminal. They decide who is subjected to attention and subsequent control. Therefore, focus on racialized communities maintains discriminatory perceptions and negative stereotyping. Stories like these that correspond with evidence that suggests higher rates of police surveillance in racialized communities may be one of the factors contributing to the overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous peoples in the Canadian criminal justice system. The next slide, please. So while Black and Indigenous communities are over-policed in many respects, members from these communities have long raised concerns over police inaction or insensitivity when it comes to their victimization. To illustrate, Black and Indigenous youth also express concern that while law enforcement officials will claim they listen and serve with compassion, these youth are able to draw on experiences that demonstrate otherwise. To illustrate, one young Black woman states that when she was younger, she often would have to call the police as she did not feel safe. But she, and I quote, would just watch the police treat me and my family like criminals when we were in fact the victims. Similarly, a young Indigenous boy would counter the notion that the police serve with compassion as they, and I quote, seem to expect bad behavior when they come and they don't care. All they see is alcoholics, drug addicts. The police don't see the good ones. They just focus on the bad and think that we're all the same. Thus, Black and Indigenous youth perceive that racial profiling leads to the underprotection of people in their communities. This places them in a vulnerable position. With a lack of trust in an institution that is meant to serve and protect them, they will not seek help when in need. And I argue that this can increase Black and Indigenous youth's risk for experiencing victimization. The next slide, please. So why do we continue to see harms perpetrated against members of Black and Indigenous communities? Why aren't we at a better place? I turn to a part of former Toronto Police Chief Mark Saunders' resignation speech to provide some insight into this question. In July 2020, in the midst of our global pandemic and the growing calls to reform law enforcement institutions, he resigned. In his message to the public, he states, "We as the police never stop. We always listen and serve with compassion. Accountability and transparency are the fabric of police trust, and public trust is the fabric that creates community safety. As this organization moves forward, I want to reassure you that we recognize that above all else, the Toronto Police Service will continue to do everything that it can to ensure that public trust is at the forefront of every word and every deed." But this is where the problem lies. Despite global calls for significant police reform, police officials continue to push hopeful and positive narratives that fail to address the cynicism and frustrations of racialized communities, as well as the sluggish pace of meaningful reform. Such canned statements continue to ignore the voices of those who are affected the most. Next slide, please. So it's important to note that in my study, some Black and Indigenous youth also discuss positive experiences with law enforcement. Many, for example, recalled positive encounters with school resource officers that were pleasant to talk to and treated them with respect. Others discuss individual officers who they had encountered had treated them fairly. Thus, simple acts of respect and fair engagement matter. But these positive experiences do not negate the impact of negative experiences that occur on the streets. For Black and Indigenous youth, police presence produces fear and anxiety. They feel that the police always view them as criminals and less deserving of protection. And I would argue that it is these negative perceptions and experiences that truly erode trust and confidence in the police within Black and Indigenous communities. The next slide, please. So as a researcher, I argue that we need more transparency from police services. In order to document racism and evaluate the impact of initiatives that aim to address anti-racism and increase public trust, we require improved race-based data collection, access, and dissemination. We also require a commitment to work with researchers, including researchers of color and members of Black and Indigenous communities who are willing to make critical inquiries into law enforcement practices. We can no longer rely on researchers or community officials that just give police the answers they want to hear. The next slide, please. So I want to end with a quote from another participant in my study. And this young Black woman states, "Not every officer is bad, But as an institution, the police gives those with biases a space and platform to target people within those groups without recourse. And this is a powerful statement that acknowledges that the issue of bias is more than just a problem of individual officers, but one that permeates the institution. Thus, for the future of Alberta policing, meaningful change requires meaningful action, and now is the time. I thank you all for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Samuels-Wortley. Attendees, please remember to post any questions inside the Q&A box ahead of our 30-minute session coming up a little bit later on. Our next presenter is Dr. Christian Leuprecht. Dr. Leuprecht, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, and we'll just wait for the PowerPoint to come up here. I want to acknowledge that even though I'm talking to you from Germany today, the RMC and Queen's University in Kingston, where I reside, is the traditional home and territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat people. And of course, this is, as Dr. Samuels-Wortley just pointed out, highly pertinent to our conversation here, because we are all part of a community that law enforcement serves. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the members that serve and the members in uniform and the daily dangers and risks that they are exposed to, and want to pay my respects and tribute to the senseless murder of Officer Andrew Hong. Next slide, please. Yeah, so you can see I have a face for radio, so we'll just skip that slide here. On to the next one, please. So let me start with the 2019 book that we did that compared policing in federal systems. One of the challenges in this domain is that while there is increasingly, in part thanks to terrific scholars such as Dr. Samuel-Wortley, empirical research and comparative research among countries, we don't have a lot of good comparative work on policing models, police governance, and so forth. And so in this book, we tried to do an initial sort of scan looking at 10 countries. And I won't bore you with the details, except to say that there are two key observations here for the purpose of this conversation. No federal country's policing setup looks like Canada's. We are absolutely unique in this very asymmetric setup where we have local forces and provincial force, and we have a federal force, but that force does contract policing and does some indigenous policing and territorial policing. And no police service in the democratic world has the span of control of the RCMP. So one starting point of the conversation, given that the RCMP is an important factor in the conversations that you're having in Alberta, is perhaps some of the challenges that we are facing is that we're simply asking, in this particular case, the federal police service to do way too much, and that no single organization could possibly have that sort of expansive expertise. And that, as Dr. Samuels-Wortley pointed out, some of these, the increasing complexity of policing is our policing structure and our services adapted to that. The other key observation here, and that's not necessarily my observation, I credit that to Harry Kitchen, an economist at Trent University, probably the world's expert in municipal and local finance. And he makes the observation that there's also no other country that funds their police services the way Canada does, and the way Canadian police services are funded, and generally the way we fund our local services in the Canadian Federation is probably the single worst model that we could possibly pick. So you already have a combination of a very odd structure that nobody else has adopted, and we might want to ask ourselves why that might be, and a rather curious funding model. Next slide, please. So let's do a quick sort of SWOT analysis of that I think will inform sort of the problem space that I want to talk about. So what are the strengths of policing in Canada? That policing in Canada thinks of itself as a profession. And by definition, professions are self-governing. And so that we've given a considerable amount of latitude to police to effectively decide on the credentialing and on the governance within their profession. The challenge here is that if professions don't evolve, and for instance, the armed forces, as you know, are currently subject to this, then the public, through their political authorities, will intervene in the ability of their profession to govern itself. And I think what we are seeing, and if there's not greater, I think, efforts to reform, you will see ever greater attempts by the public and by politicians to intervene in those professions. And that usually doesn't end well for the professions, and it usually also doesn't end well for the services that they deliver. So what we really need to think about in the context of sort of a strength of the Canadian profession is that power imbalance between members in uniform that have been given extraordinary powers to deprive people of their civil liberties, of their freedoms through detention, arrest, and otherwise, and the populations they serve. And so that power imbalance puts a particular onus on the profession of policing that is perhaps not put in that regard on other types of professions, with the with the exception of the armed forces. A key weakness that defines the problem space, is how I think about this, is the declining public trust. And so declining public trust isn't just a policing problem, it's a problem for our democratic institutions more broadly, and it's something that's been well documented over the last 30 years. But the declining public trust, in particular in police institutions, has direct implications for their effectiveness of these institutions and the legitimacy of those institutions. And I think you heard that loud and clear in the analysis that Dr. Samuels-Wortley provided in such an articulate fashion. I think this was very telling, what we just heard here in terms of the research. The opportunities that we talk about in this seminar about an opportunity for evolution. But I would pitch to you that it is too late for evolution. What policing needs in this country is transformation, because evolution can't get us from here to there, and I'll explain to you in a moment why. And so the more we simply try to do these incremental changes, the worse the situation is going to get, and I'll explain to you why. So this is why this is such an interesting conversation to have in Alberta, because you have an opportunity here to think about all these problems and think about what opportunities for reform and transformation does this space afford you? And I think this is a very unique opportunity, because the conversation that you are having is precisely the conversation that should we be having across this country, among publics, among local publics, provincial publics, and among the national public. And they are not happening. They only happen after major failures and disasters of some of the inquiries that have already been mentioned, of the Mass Casualty Commission in Nova Scotia. So when we have what are perceived as failures from law enforcement. And so I think here's an opportunity to have a proactive conversation, I think in many ways, for Alberta to lead the charge on change in this profession that can have significant spillover effects into other jurisdictions. So you have a real opportunity here in terms of getting this right and having a real impact across this country. And remember, of course, Alberta used to have its own provincial police force. So in some ways, this is not completely out of the DNA of a province. And the threats here. The threat ultimately, I think, is civilian control of police. And what this is ultimately a struggle over is who is in charge of the organization. Is it the people who are being served and their delegated representatives? Or is it police essentially deciding to govern themselves? And I think this is critical in the context of our democracy, because our democracy is premised on the rule of law. And the rule of law requires impartial institutions to enforce that rule of law. And so if we don't have an ability in a democracy to have those impartial institutions that enforce the law, that administer the law, that administers our justice system, then this will fundamentally undermine our ability to govern ourselves and to assert those democratic values that we all cherish. So this is why the conversation about police reform is so poignant. Next slide, please. So try to structure the talk sort of in three ways. One is I'll talk a little bit about community police relations. We need to set, I think, a little bit of a theoretical framework here for the challenges that I've laid out. And if you want to think about sort of what informs this, it's the basic premise of Peel's principles of policing by consent. What does policing by consent mean? I think what we just heard from Dr. Samuels-Wortley is when you can witness arbitrary and violent forms of policing, that is not consent. And so I think, how do we get back to return to a model where we have the consent of all Canadians and of all communities within this diverse country? Second, what I call the orchard problem. So we often like to talk about the bad apples and sort of there's a few bad police officers. But here's what I want to pitch to you. On the one hand, there's a conversation about how do we generate a healthy orchard? Because my pitch to you is the fundamental challenge that we have is that the orchard has been neglected and perverted. On the one hand, by police services boards and commissions, and on the other hand, by command officers. All of which leads to bad cultural roots. So if you have neglected or perverted governance and management systems, you're going to get poor roots for those trees. What does that then ensure? If you have poor cultural roots, then that will produce bad systems. And if you have bad systems, that will enable bad policing, and bad policing will allow bad apples to thrive. So we need to get beyond the conversation of this is just a few bad apples. And to have that conversation, I'll draw your attention to three separate issues: governance, culture, and policing posture, operational posture. And then I think we have a conversation about the way forward. And the way forward here for me is very much about the efficacy of the system we have in place. The police services acts we have in place, the oversight bodies, the boards, the chiefs, the commands, and the senior officer systems. And how do we fundamentally change those institutional characteristics? Next slide, please. So think about this as a relationship between police and community. So I adapt sort of the model from civil-military relations. It's not entirely adaptable, but for the sake of our conversation here, I think it will suffice. When you think of three broad stakeholders that are having this relationship here. One is the people that are being served. Another is, so that's sort of the passions, if you want. Another one is government, which is supposed to be sort of the rational interest that aggregates these different sort of competing views of people of what should be done. And then, of course, you have policing, police, law enforcement as the institution. And so I would say that we need to think about what are sort of some of the options for how we govern ourselves effectively in that framework, in the relationship between police, government, and the people. And so the fundamental, I think, traditional approach to this is what you might call the functional imperative. And the functional imperative is premised on objective control. That is to say, we basically provide direction and funding for police. The public is supposed to provide direction and funding for police. And then police are supposed to, we leave them alone and they sort of get to carry out their mandate. Because we're concerned that we don't want to have political interference and so forth. And how often have I heard in different governance mechanisms that, oh God, we can't interfere in operations in matters that are, if you have an investigation, that's an operation. If you're talking about characteristics such as Dr. Samuels-Wortley has pointed out, that's hardly interfering in operation. It's about asking about sort of the broader services that the service provides. The problem, of course, with the functional imperative and the objective control model is that policing has never worked like that in Canada. Because you might argue that, by and large, municipal services have never allocated the resources that police, for instance, would actually need. If you look at most police services, they're completely tapped out. And I think you saw this with the illegal Ottawa occupation. When we were looking for surge capacity, it took us weeks to generate that capacity. That shows you that there is no sort of residual capacity within the system. The point that I'm trying to make here is that the assumptions that we have about objective control and policing in Canada simply don't apply. And we can have a whole separate talk about why that doesn't apply. So then what are some of the other options? So we can have professional police officers. So the idea that rather than police being separate from the community and we let them do their thing, they're actually inherently part of that community. And so they need to reflect that community in terms of their composition, in terms of their values, in terms of their operations. There's principal agent theory. So the public as the principal and police as the agent. And so when the principal tasks police to do something and doesn't get the outcomes that it sees, what are some of the challenges in terms of the relationship between that principal and that agent? So for instance, Peter Fever here, who's a well-known scholar in civil military relations, one of his keen observations is shirking. that when uniform organizations get instructions that they don't like, they'll simply drag their heels and they'll shirk. So it's one of the reasons why I think principal agents theory is relevant here. That's the institutional occupational thesis. Is policing really an occupation sort of set apart from the rest of society, or is it really just members in uniform that are essentially carrying out tasks that you would find in the same way in civilian society? And so maybe it's not actually an institution that is all that different. Next slide, please. So I would submit to you that in terms of police-community relations in this country, we have the perfect storm. So let me start with sort of what I mean by that. We have an increasing shift in terms of expectations by the public. And we've had a rapid evolution in terms of expectations by the public, also in terms of how certain forms of policing, for instance, are done. Some of these expectations mean that some of these tasks take a lot more time for police to perform. There's a lot more paperwork and stuff to fill in. But I think the broader sort of point here is that policing, that there's exponential societal change, and as a result, exponential change in terms of the expectations of publics towards generally democratic institutions, but in particular towards policing. Now, I would also submit that many of these expectations are unrealistic and come from people and from communities that have a fundamental misconception of policing. Much of that misconception is informed by US policing. And I would say that Canadian policing is actually not like US policing. And so comparisons with the US are profoundly unhelpful. We're much closer, for instance, to a UK system, but also to Australia's system of policing. And yet, of course, this is how most people think about policing. I mean, simple things like I travel with a colleague where we want to have fun in the evening. We'll have a beer, we'll turn on the TV, we'll pick any crime show, and we'll start to count the number of legal and constitutional violations by police in that show. Things that just you could never do in a regular uniformed organization. So, of course, all that to say is that I think the public has a distorted and sort of misinformed view, and this is also why these webinars are so important, because we need to raise the level of informed conversation. Some of these conversations to me are sometimes like, you know, if you've ever been to a debate between a theist and an atheist, it's like two people that are debating on two separate planes, and those planes never meet. That's sometimes what sort of the conversation about policing and police reform in this country seems to me like. But here's the kicker, right? So we have exponential societal change, unrealistic community expectations, but we only have incremental institutional change in terms of reform. And so what is happening is the delta continues to widen between public expectations and police and police institutions. And this is why reform or evolution is simply not an option. Because if you simply evolve the organization, the delta between public expectations and the organization will continue to widen. So, and this is why this is such a fantastic opportunity that you have in Alberta. I just want to raise a couple of other sort of other points here when we talk about the perfect storm here. Deinstitutionalization. That, of course, societies, for both human rights reasons, but also for simple fiscal reasons, have decided to deinstitutionalize a whole host of individuals and basically sort of left them up to themselves. And so there we can have broader sort of conversation about social determinants of health and criminogenic factors. But for instance, the fact that a substantial portion of individuals who have violent encounters with police or who end up being shot by police also have mental health issues, for instance. So the deinstitutionalization issue is a corollary of the divestment issue, where I think we've seen 25 years of governments divesting from social services. And so guess who's there at 3 a.m. when somebody or something sort of gets out of hand? Well, I guess you call the police, right? So you call this generalist agency that, you know, is doing their best to deal with, you know, and presumably you wouldn't call the police if you weren't expecting that this was going to be a difficult interaction, right? You know, presumably you just have a conversation with the individual. But I think that divestment has then also resulted, is one of the drivers of over-policing, because it means if we can't get effective social services to some communities, then one response is, well, you call the police every time you think you have a challenge. And the reason I mention this is because, of course, the RCMP in Alberta polices the vast parts of the rural parts of the province. And so this is exacerbated in rural Canada, where of course services investment is substantially aggravated over even urban areas. You can't get the services in urban areas. Just imagine how you're going to get these services to rural areas. And so so this just to say it's a very tough job that police have to do, and the expanded use of force options that on the one hand I think has significantly reduced the force, the violent sort of incidents, shooting incidents and the like, but it also provides an incentive for police to resort perhaps more expeditiously to other types of use of force options. And I would encourage anybody who's not familiar with it to consult the use of force model. When we see police resorting to use of force, there is a model that guides when it is appropriate to resort to what type of force. And so we actually have an empirical metric to judge whether the sort of interactions that, for instance, that are documented with communities meet that use of force model. Two other quick points. One is socialization, that of course uniformed organizations are what psychologists like to call tightly coupled organizations. And that means that there's a very strong and heavy socialization effect. And that means there's a relatively strong conformity effect. And so that means these organizations are, as a result, notoriously more difficult to reform. And the other is a simple point about bureaucracies, that police, like other government institutions, are a large bureaucracy. And what do bureaucracies do best? They reproduce themselves, right? So if you think about bureaucracy sort of as a river, the river will just keep flowing unless you stick your finger in it and then the water starts flowing around it, right? So I think we need to start thinking about how do we actually direct that water so we actually get it to flow the way sort of we want it to flow, because clearly the way the water is flowing isn't entirely meeting sort of public expectations in some cases at least. Next slide, please. I won't take you through all of these, but police governance in this country is in crisis. This is just a selection of the reports. And if you particularly want to understand sort of some of the governance challenges, you might especially want to look at the Tulloch report from 2017 about independent police oversight review. If you need just a simplistic representation of just how in crisis governance is, until 2.5 weeks ago, there were 13 police services in Ontario looking for a new chief. Now there are 12 because the Toronto Police Service, after 2 years of an acting interim chief, has now decided on a new chief. That alone tells you that there's something wrong with the system when everybody's trying to find new leadership for the system. But I also caution about that approach because, of course, this is the approach that we always take with the RCMP when we try to go at RCMP reform. Well, we don't like what the institution is doing, so let's get ourselves a new commissioner. And then we're surprised that we get the reproduction of the same problems within the organization. And so what do? Well, we get ourselves a new commissioner. And what's the definition of insanity? You do the same thing over and over and you expect a different outcome, right? So yes, we have leadership challenges, but I think those leadership challenges are representative of the broader challenges in terms of the crisis of governance in policing in this country. And that's not just a crisis on the uniform side, it is also a crisis on the side of boards. And if you need any empirical evidence, if you watched how the board in Ottawa dissolved during the greatest national security crisis that this country has faced in recent decades, that suggests to you just how unrobust and unprepared we are in terms of police governance in this country. Next slide, please. So then my pitch, as you might have already gathered from the introductory remarks, is that we need to move from a system of objective control, where we basically let police sort of do the policing, to a system of subjective control, where we find a much better dialogue between folks in uniform and folks who are doing the management and the governance. And that has a whole bunch of sort of implications, I think. It has an implication for a different relationship between boards and chiefs, because it's the one mechanism of control that police services boards have. Most citizens don't even know that they have a police services board, let alone that they can go to that board, and that board is ultimately in charge of setting the direction for that police service. So there's the subjective sort of control argument here in terms of the involvement by boards in policing, and that's the whole point of why we have boards. There's also then the broader issue of, does the way we actually run these organizations make any sense? Look, what people do is they work their way up for decades through the organization, and eventually you become an inspector, and you become a super, and a chief super, and you become the deputy chief, and then you become the chief. Well, which other organization do you know of that still functions in that way? Most organizations have professional civilians that run particular parts of the system, the HR system, the finance system. And you might say under HR, I would also sort of count discipline. So why is it that we're putting people who really sort of are generalists and have no particular training in terms of how we run organizations that, in the case of the Toronto Police Service, $1 billion organization, right? I mean, in any other industry, if you had $1 billion organization, you would be looking for a CEO with absolutely exceptional managerial credentials. This is in no way a reflection of any of the chiefs in Toronto. I'm simply picking Toronto because I happen with the number in terms of the number of people who work for the service and the budget, and it's a service that's representative. And it's not to say that members in uniform can't have exceptional managerial skills, but I think when you have 12 organizations in Ontario looking for chiefs, it suggests that perhaps these managerial skills are just a little bit hard to come by. But I think where does the ultimate fault lie? Well, we always go after the frontline members, and we need to put cameras on people and so forth. Well, where do I put the responsibility? Among politicians, because they ultimately generate the frameworks, the legislative frameworks under which police operate. And some of the problems that police are facing, they can't fix themselves. We don't fix the legislative frameworks that ultimately enable the governance and the accountability measures and so forth. I also lay blame at boards. Look, who gets appointed to boards? In many cases, they're people who are political hacks. They're people who have cozy relationships with city councils. So we're not necessarily getting the most qualified people. We don't have particularly rigorous training for members of boards, and most members of boards are heavily constrained in terms of times, resources, and expertise. So so no surprise that sort of in many cases boards and commissions underperform. I say many cases, not in all cases, and I give a lot of credit to the Canadian Association of Police Governance for their very heavy lifting on improving police governance. And then of course the management side. And I think one way around on the management side is, why do we have police running all these organizations? What's wrong with having a civilian run the organization and leaving just the policing up to police? But I think it might also be a more efficient and effective allocation of resources. And I think there is a police service in this country where you may very soon see this as an experiment. What do we need to do? Well, strategic plans. Strategic plans should be outlining the priorities, objectives, and policies for police. But if you look at most strategic plans, they don't do any of the sort. They're sort of blue sky, sort of wishful sort of things, metrics that are unmeasurable. Why do strategic plans matter? Because strategic plans should be driving the business plans that the chiefs then for the chiefs in each of the given years, so that chiefs can demonstrate that they're achieving the objectives that were set by the board, and they then need to drive the budget out. So as opposed to the chief coming and saying, well, a collective agreement went up by 2.3%, so I'm going to need to have 2.3% more budget. The chief actually needs to come and say, this is what the incremental investment in policing will achieve in terms of this particular business plan, and here's how we can measure that this business plan is actually delivering on strategic plans. Some police boards do this quite well. Most, this is a bit of a challenge. Policy. Much of the policy that we have is outdated. Classic example, the Ottawa illegal occupation. The major events policy by the Ottawa board, by the Ottawa police, was hopelessly outdated. Why was it outdated? Because the provincial policy was hopelessly outdated. So, if we don't set proper, so provinces can do a lot here. I think we have a significant challenge around accountability, transparency, and resources. Try to get, as a public member, even as a board member, getting an insight into where exactly all the money goes within your organization. You can get these very high-level metrics of where the money goes. But, I think some of the critics have a point when they say, it's like, where's the money all going? And we just kind of say, well, we need all this money. But if we say we need all this money, we also need to be transparent in where it's going. And I think we need to think very much about staffing when it comes to subjective control, because ultimately we need to be representative of the populations that we serve. Next slide, please. So in my troika of sort of challenges in terms of the orchard, you've seen the crisis and governance. Now I want to talk very briefly about the operational model that I also think is in crisis. It's in crisis because of the leadership challenges that we face. And that is not to say that there are not some very innovative police leaders. I think in particular Dale McPhee of the Edmonton Police Service is certainly one of the people who's driven significant change in this country. So you're quite lucky in Alberta in that regard. I think there's a paradigm change, and we got this tension in the previous, I think, presentation as well, between community policing and enforcement. And so what's the appropriate balance here? And I think there's the shift towards away from enforcement and towards community policing. And I think police have a bit of a challenging time with that. On the operating model, I think I'm not sure how many constables think of them as providing a public service and treat the individuals with whom they interact as clients. So I think changing that relationship and how we think about that relationship. Yes, those clients might be people who committed some horrendous crimes or whatnot, or at least are thought to have, but that still means that they get treated with dignity and respect. And I think that can at least get us a bit of a way forward. Then there's the issues of fourth generation police are now struggling with the same hiring challenges that many other organizations are. And if you're having a bad rap, then you're not going to be particularly an employer of choice. So how do you actually make a police an employer of choice? This is a particular challenge when it comes to Indigenous representation in police forces, and how to make sure that we provide more opportunity for Indigenous people in police forces, targeted opportunities, and then of course also forced employment. If you want to see the most significant sort of challenges and struggles and criticisms in organizations, you can talk about promotion and you can talk about deployment. And there's one interesting puzzle here that my colleague Jamie Farrell has just done a book on. Why is it that people in uniformed organizations are notoriously unhappy? So if the public is unhappy with their organizations, let me tell you, in many of these organizations where I talk to members, they are profoundly unhappy. So it is, if you're having an unhappy organization, unhappy institutional culture, it's not entirely surprising that you're also not having optimal service delivery. Next slide, please. And I'm almost done here. So culture, although I put it last in my troika here, of course, it is the root of your tree. So if you can't get your culture right, you're not going to be able to produce the sort of fruit that you're ultimately looking for, and you're not going to be able to have a healthy orchard. And so that requires much broader conversations about institutional culture and how we change institutional culture. That means changing the educational model. I mean, policing is sort of the only profession that I can think of where, I mean, in other jobs, you have to go out, you get your education, and once you have those qualifications, think of a physician or a lawyer, then you might apply to a hospital or you might apply to a law firm. Well, policing, well, it turns out you just apply, and then somehow the organization pays for you to acquire the skill sets that you're already supposed to have. This is completely puzzling to me. So I think, and I think other countries, if you look at most European countries, they have a streamed mechanism of constables and officers. Constables do at least a year of full policing education, and officers do 2 years, usually as a graduate degree. So I think there's a lot to be done there. And then, of course, in terms of culture, we need institutional diversity. Both, and I think there's long-standing challenges around diversity where police services will say, well, look, we're doing better. We have more people from equity-seeking groups. But the challenge is that in many cases, those members still have to conform to a rather rigid institutional model in order to be accepted, in order to be promoted. Next slide, please. And that's the last slide. So my pitch on the governance side, we need to have conversations about civilian leadership and which aspects of the organization can we civilianize, both in terms of service delivery and on management side. We need to have conversations about board and board selections and board certifications and board training. On posture, We need to, I think, talk about, there's an opportunity to talk about a provincial police agency, all these little police services running their own HR and promotion systems and grievance and discipline systems. This isn't working. We need to scale this up to the provincial level, and then local municipalities lease their services back from the provincial level. This is how most sensible federations run their police services. Think of Germany, think of Australia, for instance. And I think that provincial framework will give you better bang for your buck in terms of fiscal payoff, functional payoff, and in terms of the essential services that you deliver. I think we can have a conversation about tiered policing. Quebec has a tiered policing model, 6 tiers of policing, depending on how large your police service is. That depends what sort of services your service can deliver. I was compared Ottawa with Gatineau. If you had the sort of Ottawa occupation in Gatineau instead of in Ottawa, it is not the local police service Gatineau that would have been in charge. It is the Sûreté du Québec, because the Gatineau police service would have not had the mandate to police a national protest. And so I think one of the things that we saw in Ottawa is that the Ottawa police service and the Ottawa chief were completely out of depth in terms of running a sustained response that this sort of national protest would have required, in terms of posture conversations about civilianization. And then on the culture side, I think we need to have conversations about proper accreditation for policing, educational requirements, career progression frameworks, which there's no systematic, there's often complete lack of systematic career progression frameworks. I think provinces can mandate that. I've talked about staffing streams. I think recruitment, retention, and promotional mechanisms should be run at the provincial level. This gets us out of all the nepotism and sort of the challenges that we saw in Toronto, where people are trying to cheat and trying to get their favorite candidates promoted and whatnot. I think we need to, on remuneration, decouple rank from skill sets. We want to remunerate people for the skill sets they have, not for rank. Part of the reason why people rise up through the ranks is so that they can make more money. But of course, in many cases, that's the wrong motivation for people to rise up, because they might be a great investigator, but they might simply not be a particularly good manager. And I also think discipline mechanisms, we're going to have to scale up to a provincial level in order to restore public confidence in those discipline measures. Next slide, please. That's a bunch of stuff that I've written, but you can kind of go back to that sort of at your leisure. And then next slide, please. That's just my email address. If you you probably disagreed with half of what I said, so I invite you to bring forward your questions, your criticisms, or to email me, and so we can have a conversation about this. But I hope you took something away from my presentation here. Thanks for your attention and your interest.
Appreciate your time. Thank you, Dr. Leuprecht. Well, that brings us to the question and answer portion of the webinar. A reminder, if you have any questions for either presenter, please post them in the Q&A box. We'll get to some questions now, beginning with Dr. Samuels-Wortley. The first question is, I heard Toronto's police service is collecting race-based data. What do you think about the recently released report, and is this a positive step?
Thank you so much for that question. That's a great question. Yes, I think it is a positive step now that the Toronto Police Service recognizes that it is important to collect race-based data. And I think that this is speaking to the accountability to Black and other racialized communities in the city. I think for too long, there's been a denial about the tensions and the over-policing of certain communities. So I think that by us now collecting this data, we'll be able to have the numbers to demonstrate that we're not just focusing on the stories, which are just as important. We need to have the numbers as well to support the stories and to have the two together in order to provide a nuanced understanding of the impact of over-policing in certain communities. And I think that this is something that other police services, a model that they can adopt. And I think that this would be important as well for the Alberta model to see the importance of gathering this data. And once we have this data, we then can develop meaningful strategies to see what it is and why it is that there are certain communities, or why it is certain individuals are stopped more by police. This can lead to meaningful strategies as well as training opportunities, and simply to be held accountable for actions that are having an impact on racialized peoples in Toronto, speaking in Toronto, but definitely this is something that the Alberta model can can adopt.
Thank you very much. To Dr. Leuprecht now, you mentioned Peel's principles. Number 7 states that the police are the public and the public are the police, with the police having the ultimate authority and get paid to keep the peace. How do we institutionalize this in our Canadian society in the 21st century?
So it's a fantastic question, because one of the things that I actually cut out of the presentation was, if you look at Peel's principles of policing, how would you rewrite them for the 21st century, and in particular in the sort of very diverse and social media environment that we live in? And so the critical sort of relationship between the public and police. I think, let me just kind of make one comment here and reference Jean-Paul Brodeur, one of the best known, and maybe the best known Canadian criminologist, now deceased. And he makes this distinction between high policing and low policing. High policing is policing in the interests of elites. Low policing is policing in the interests of communities. And you saw this reflected in Dr. Samuels-Wortley's presentation as well. And that when we have a perception among certain communities in this country that policing is mainly in the interest of high policing rather than low policing, we owe these communities an engagement in the dialogue. Now, I think the really interesting, one of the many interesting aspects about Dr. Samuels-Wortley's research is, so how do we actually tease that out? Which of this is actually a perception problem, and which of this is something that we can empirically document as a factual problem in terms of that problem of high policing and low policing? But ultimately, if we want to live in a democracy where we can all share democratic values, we have to get to a point where all communities feel that the policing that they receive is ultimately policing that is in their interests, that it reflects their norms, their values. So that's to say, their needs, their values, and their expectations. And the challenge boards, police boards and commissions currently have, and it is an unenviable challenge, having just gone through a strategic planning process myself, is that they have to mediate the needs, values, and expectations of the multiple communities in their particular jurisdiction, and then weave those together into a meaningful strategic plan that effectively represents those as needs, values, and expectations of the community that is being policed as a whole. And I think we haven't done a particularly effective job among boards in many instances at trying to mediate the competing needs, values, and expectations in an increasingly diverse society. And I think that shows that our governance system is under strain, because the mechanism that we have in policing for mediating that is, as I said, staffed by people who may be on that board for any number of reasons that have nothing to do with their expertise. And even if they have expertise, they'll be severely constrained in terms of the resources and in terms of the time that is available to them and that is available to the board. And so we need to find mechanisms to mediate those competing community interests within the democratic governance mechanisms that we have, because by default, if we don't do that, we're going to basically defer to police chiefs in an objective fashion to basically decide how this is best done. And we can see both in the quote from Chief Saunders, as well as from the critiques of a number of communities, that this isn't working particularly well at a police leadership level, and that really needs to be a task that boards have to perform.
Appreciate that. Thank you very much to Dr. Samuels-Wortley once again. And a short question, but a pretty complex one. How can we change the systemic racism in our police forces?
Ooh, that is a very short and very complex question, and I certainly don't have enough time to speak to the number of strategies that we need to do in order to address systemic racism. One of the first points is to document, to have this race-based data in order for us to see disparities. And I kind of wanted to respond to Dr. Leuprecht, and what he mentioned in terms of, in terms of perceptions, and how do we know in terms of high policing and the policing within communities. And I didn't have the opportunity to speak to the perceptions of white youth and how they felt about the police. And I think that even just looking at perceptions is a great way to document this, because there was a very distinct difference in how both communities perceive police. So white communities in relation to racialized communities. For a lot of white youth, their sentiments followed along what police are meant to do. So if we follow Sir Peel's idea of policing, that is very much what white youth were expressing. And this is based on experience. They felt that they were protected when they called the police. They felt that the police cared when they were called upon. And so this is so different in comparison to the way that Black and Indigenous youth express their experiences with the police. So in order for us to show what does systemic racism look like, that it's important for us to understand the experiences and to make sure that we are collecting that data to have an idea as to where are we seeing areas that are over policed, where are we seeing individuals that are more likely to be charged for certain offenses as opposed to others, who's being cautioned more, who's being. So it has to get down to the data. And once we have an opportunity and data to see all forms of procedures and processes through the law enforcement strategies, that's only when we can actually address and see where we can start targeting certain areas and certain concerns, and have a better understanding of the differences and disparities that we are seeing within our system.
Can I just do a hot pursuit on this?
Yeah.
Of course.
I was absolutely shocked when the commissioner of the RCMP goes before committee and initially says that we don't have a problem with institutional racism.
Yep.
Remember, where did the commissioner come from? The commissioner ran D.E.A. She ran the training institution for the RCMP. All I can say is, and you wonder why we have challenges in that institution. So
Absolutely.
I think we actually need to change the conversation around institutional racism when it comes to public institutions in this country. That we have to assume by default that public institutions in this country, because of their colonial history, are racist. And if we change that discourse, then now we can have a conversation as politicians, as boards, and as police chiefs to imagine what would an institution look like if it were not racist, or rather no longer racist. And what does the pathway look like? And that pathway is painful. I would say that Toronto Police is attempting that somewhat with its current transformation plan, but that really this needs to be part of strategic plans. And I think when people talk about how do we decolonize institutions, this requires a concrete plan, not just conversations about are we racist or not and how does this manifest, but how do we extract those institutional constraints from the institution, and how do we do it expeditiously in a transformational fashion, because we don't have 5 or 10 or 20 years, especially in a city like Toronto and the diversity of Toronto, but in a country that is as diverse as Canada, and where the highest demographic, the highest fertility rates are among primarily communities from equity-seeking groups. That is an urgent conversation.
And I'll come right back to you, Dr. Leuprecht, for the next question, unless you had something you wanted to add, Dr. Samuels-Wortley.
I did. Very briefly, I couldn't agree more. And I think that one of a very important strategy is to have an understanding of our Canada's historical history right from the beginning, for police officers to be trained and understand that we are based on colonialist laws that have had a significant impact on Indigenous communities, which has led to intergenerational trauma, and what that looks like and how that can potentially lead into engagements in certain behaviors and such that we are now seeing that end up within the criminal justice system. And it's very similar to Black communities as well. Many do not still don't think that slavery existed in our country, but it did. We were very much part of the colonialist perspective as well, and very much had enslavement on Canadian land, and how that has an impact on the way that Black peoples have been perceived historically and continue to be perceived historically in our country. And I think without that basic understanding for police officers when they are engaging with Black and Indigenous communities on the streets, there won't be an understanding. There will continue to be tensions with the engagement and perceptions and stereotypes about what it is to be Black or what it is to be Indigenous, and it simply leads to criminality. But we don't have a basic understanding of our history to speak to the traumas that have led to a lot of the areas of tensions that we are seeing within these communities.
Thank you for that. Just continuing to alternate with the questions and to Dr. Leuprecht now. The major municipalities with their own police services in Alberta already have several levels of accountability or discipline that deal with issues as they arise. You mentioned that there are some bad apples in policing. How would a modern provincial police board or commission with true governance, civilian oversight, and accountability keep members in line?
So sorry, I hesitate here to make sure I give a succinct answer, because I just did a whole book on accountability and governance of intelligence services. So we could be at this for a while. But I think this is ultimately, in a democracy, the key component, that all public institutions have to be answerable to the public and have to be accountable to the public. I would say that policing in Canada is not as bad as some of the critics make it out to be. For instance, our use of force numbers are quite low. If you look at the thousands of interactions and the relatively few use of force interactions that we have, but every citizen needs to be able to have the confidence that if they feel that they were not treated properly and the way that they should, that they can lodge that complaint. And it starts with, most citizens would have no idea where to go, right? So why do they go to the media? Because they have no idea where to go. If you have a complaint with your bank, if you have a complaint against a teacher, people know there's a college of teachers, you can lodge a complaint or so forth. So, and I think that's because we have this very diffuse system. So that's my proposal, that we actually make this, and make no mistake, discipline matters suck up a huge amount of resources for institutions, right? So not only on the investigation side, but you might need to suspend that person with pay and completely remove them. You might have to put them in an administrative job. In many cases, you might have to do that for years until the process plays out in some of the more severe cases. So we want to minimize discipline, and I think that's where education is so important. We want to minimize discipline measures, but we need to make sure the public has confidence. And I think that requires really an independent provincial mechanism. I think we want to get police services out of that, both because it sucks up so much of their own resources, and because I think the public simply doesn't have the confidence when you have a local service investigating themselves, even though I believe that the investigations that I'm familiar with, that police actually do a very rigorous job at disciplining their own members. The problem is, many of these discipline matters are often things that are brought internally against a member, so the public will never even know that a discipline action was brought against a member, and that discipline action is never released. So we don't even have data on how many people sort of get disciplined, what they get disciplined for. So unless it is sort of a major sort of public sort of a criminal or so disciplinary matter. So I think simply actually releasing those data, having independent processes at the provincial level that give the public confidence that this is being run in a professional, arm's length manner. I mean, our SIUs are not perfect, but I think we've learned something from our SIU processes. But why is it that we only have these provincial mechanisms when somebody dies or sustains sort of serious harm in the hands of police? Why can we not just simply have a provincial mechanism in all cases where and thus ensure both the professional and the independence when people do lodge complaints? and then also find a way to make public some of the findings rather than telling people, well, it was dismissed, you know, we didn't find anything. And I think that leaves people profoundly dissatisfied as well. Enough said there.
Anything to add, Dr. Samuels-Wortley?
Yeah, that I agree that this is a process that needs to be more transparent and the public needs to be made aware. Because I think the reason why there continues to be a disjunction and a misunderstanding as to what the process may be internally, and this perception that officers continue to that are not actually being dealt with when there is a form of misconduct, is simply because we as the public are not aware and don't know. If there is an officer that has been disciplined, we do not know this, and this is a problem. And I consider the New York City model, which they actually put out publicly all of their officers and indicate who has been perhaps may have a complaint against them. And I think that this is important for us to know. It's important for us to know who are on our streets and who are policing our streets and who are engaging with the public, and concerns that there might be with that particular officer, or if perhaps we'll have more data knowing that there might be a certain service that doesn't have as many misconduct issues, so we can learn from that. So it's just, data is very important and transparency is very important for us to have a better sense and idea as to how police officers who do engage in misconduct are, how they're being held accountable. It's important for the public to know.
Mitch, just a quick pursuit on this, and this is a classic example of where police can't fix it themselves, because much of the system is dictated by the legislation in place. And so the rigor of the legislation is going to determine very much both the process of the system as well as the outcomes of the system. And yes, everybody is entitled to be presumed innocent, even in a disciplinary proceeding. But I don't think that in most provinces in this country, the way the legislation is currently is written serves neither the best interests of police and the institution, nor the best interests of the public.
Well, speaking of the best interest of the public, Dr. Samuels-Wortley, the next question asks of you, how do we start to reduce overrepresentation of Indigenous and Black peoples in our criminal justice system? Another one that would probably require an extended period of time,
yeah,
but do your best given the constraints.
Sit in on one of my classes or one of my, and we can talk about this for a few weeks. That's a great question. And I just kind of what I spoke to is for us to have an understanding as to how our historical makeup has had an impact specifically on these two communities, how that has had an impact on perceptions and stereotypes and such. So it is very important for us to recognize that historical trauma has had an impact on these communities, which can lead to engagement in crime. But it's also important to understand that racial bias as well is part of why we are seeing an overrepresentation of certain peoples in our justice system. So it really comes, that's such a complex question, but it comes down to an understanding of the experiences of Black and Indigenous peoples in this country, and having an understanding of the number of barriers that are placed within the members of these communities, and how it can lead to a cyclical form of poverty and such, which then leads to potential engagement in crime. But then also it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, and then there's then assumptions about who Black and Indigenous peoples are and that they're criminal. But so it's just it's such a nuanced conversation that requires a deep understanding of the barriers and impacts of bias and discrimination, and how it is influential in all social institutions. It's certainly policing is one that is very important for us to focus on, but there are so many other areas within our system, the healthcare, education, and such, that continues to be a barrier for members of Black and Indigenous communities.
Thank you for that. Difficult question for the context here in terms of time. Dr. Leuprecht, likely getting towards the last question for you, given that we have a hard out at the top of the hour, but the next question asks of you, do you see the growing number of partnerships between municipal police services and social agencies as improving public trust?
So I think the community safety plans, for instance, in Ontario are an important step forward. And drawing up plans for entire communities of how systems need to interact. Of course, Dale McPhee was a pioneer in this country on the individual level in making sure that different services collaborate more effectively. If we are heavily resource constrained as we are in terms of our public service delivery, then simply from an economic perspective, you can argue that we need to optimize the allocation of resources. And the moment you make a problem a police or law enforcement problem, you've now securitized that problem. And when you securitize that problem, let me assure you, there is no more expensive solution, both in terms of financial expense as well as the human toll, than to make something a criminal justice problem. So what is that we can do in terms of allocating those resources to find ways that don't predominantly securitize particular problems? And I think that's a difficult conversation, but I think that's where the partnerships are useful. I do think there's probably also a bigger opportunity for partnerships, not just with the public sector, but also with the private sector and some of the service delivery. I think where this question is particularly pertinent is any members from rural Alberta where these collaborations are especially important given the relative paucity of services available. But often police have the resources and the leadership to coordinate some of these other institutions. But of course, we want to make sure that this is not a police-led effort, that is a community-led effort. I think we've made significant progress here, but there's a lot more heavy lifting to done.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So many fascinating questions and so little time to really delve into them to the length that so many of us would like to be able to. And I think given that, we may have time for just one more, and I'll go to Dr. Samuels-Wortley for that. This is, again, quite complex. It said, would a shift to a new police service in Alberta be a chance to improve relations with racialized communities, given the challenges in the historic relationship with the RCMP?
That is another complex question, but a fantastic one, and I want to try to answer this as quickly as possible. I think one of the issues with the RCM police model is that you are not having officers that are part of the community, that then will not understand local issues that are particular, the unique areas of focus within a certain community. And I think that this is what potentially can be a benefit of adopting an Alberta model, is that you then can have individuals who have a longer tenure or a longer time within a certain community, then can have an understanding what it is specific to that community and how policing can be done. Because it's very important to recognize that not all issues concerning that are the concern of the police will be the same across the board. So it's very important to have officers that have an understanding of the area that they are policing. And I think the issue with the RCMP model is that there isn't an opportunity to gain local ties to that community, and as a result, because a certain tenure may end and then is on to another area. And I think that is what we can see changed by adopting a provincial model, is that you can have officers that are in an area for a longer period of time and get to know that area and the specific needs of that area and community. That then can lead to meaningful engagements with that community and potentially lead to change with how the police engage with all individuals, including racialized individuals within that community.
Mitch, can I have a 10-second, just a quick pursuit on this? That I think the takeaway from this is, if you simply take the RCMP in Alberta and turn it into a provincial police force, it would be a tragic missed opportunity.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that powerful way to close things out. We appreciate the time. We appreciate all of the questions. Thank you to the participants for submitting them. If we didn't get to your question, or you would like to view one of our previous webinars, you can do that. You can visit the Future of Alberta Policing website for more information in those regards. Special thanks to our panelists today, Dr. Kanika Samuels-Wortley and Dr. Christian Leuprecht, for their insights. Attendees, thank you for joining us this morning. Take care, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.